Ghosts are something that me and my family have experienced quite frequently. This is my personal story as the narrator and author for this channel. It all started when I was young. I was about 5 years old and my family had moved houses. The house that we moved to was built by my parents, so naturally, no one would have been able to have died there. My house was the last house on the left. It was kind of tucked away back in the corner. The right side of the house and backyard was covered with endless woods. The woods went on for what seemed like forever. We moved into the house and everything seemed fine. The house was 2 stories plus a basement. The basement was unfinished, and it always had a creepy factor to it. My house was on a hill and the backyard sloped downwards. The woods in my backyard kind of had a swampy feel to it, and there was mud pretty much everywhere. I remember the day that the paranormal activity started. I was about 6 at this time. We'd been living in the house for about a year. I was out in the woods one afternoon when I started to hear what sounded like a drum beating in the distance. Being so young and curious, I followed the sounds into the woods. It wasn't until I got closer that I started to hear chanting. The chanting wasn't in English, but for some reason, it still made me uncomfortable. At this point, my curiosity was being overpowered by my fear, and I decided to turn around. Before I started walking back, I started to feel a presence only a couple of yards away. The presence felt dark and angry. I walked back to my house and I thought nothing of it. That dark presence lingered the entire time. Whatever it was, whatever lingered, followed me home that day. Ever since then, we would see a man that looked to be covered in mud in our backyard. We would only see him for but a moment before he would disappear back into the woods. Thankfully, whatever it was would stay near the woods. Things would change when I would get older. The mudman would get much closer to the house as time went on. It got to the point that we would sometimes see him peering into our windows. There were 2 occasions where my mother saw the mudman peering into our house. Naturally, she called the police both times, to which they were not able to do anything. I remember one night that my mother was cleaning when she accidentally spilt 2 chemicals together. In fear that she created toxic fumes, she left all the windows and doors to our house open in order to air out the chemicals. The next morning, we were horrified to find a set of muddy footprints leading into our house. After a quick search of the house, we found no one inside. We never saw the mudman again. However, things inside of our home would change. The paranormal activity started in our basement. The basement was dark and unfinished, and hardly no one went down there, although at night we would hear sounds coming from down below. We would never check during the night, but we would the next day, to which we would never find anything. The basement did have a furnace and a water heater, so we figured maybe that's what was causing the noise, and we just didn't notice it before. We would always keep the basement door locked. Me and my siblings were always terrified of the basement. We feared that if we ever left it unlocked, whatever was down there would come up and get us. I remember that our bedrooms weren't too far from the basement door. Sometimes late at night, we could swear that we would sometimes hear the door handle jingle. It was as if something down there was trying to come up. Thankfully, as long as we kept the basement door locked, whatever was down there would seem to stay down there. I remember one night, whatever the reason, we forgot to lock the basement door. This would be a huge mistake. I remember hearing the sound of the door handle jingling and eventually opening. I remember seeing the next morning the basement door being wide open. Whatever was down in the basement was now upstairs in the house. The presence wouldn't really do much. It would just linger. I think something about it didn't like the light. That's why it stayed in the basement for so long. Weird things would happen. Doors would open. We would hear random footsteps throughout the house. Our dogs would bark at nothing. It loved to open our doors at night, setting off our alarm system, waking up everyone. As time would pass, we would just kind of get used to these weird things. It was just part of the house at this point. My friends were always uncomfortable. They wanted nothing to do with the basement. As I got older, my parents decided to finish the basement. This took about 6 to 8 months, but once it was finished, they decided to put me and my brother's bedrooms down there. This was quite terrifying. Our bedrooms were next to the furnace room, to where we think it lived. At night, we would often hear it lunk around in that other room, but eventually the presence would eventually make its way into our rooms. The presence wasn't necessarily evil, it was just curious. At night, I would often hear it move around my room, and it would shuffle its feet on the carpet. Things started to get worse when I became a teenager. I started to get depression, and whatever it was seemed to feed off of it, making it stronger. Instead of just shuffling around and acting curious, this seemed to be more invasive. I think that it realized that if it made me depressed, that it could feed off of it and become stronger. My nights became plagued by this thing. I could feel this thing hovering over me as I tried to sleep. And once I was asleep, I would get these awful nightmares. These nightmares were the most severe and most vivid dreams I've ever had. I remember one night being woken up because my bed was shaking. I was covered in sweat and I was completely terrified. I felt like I was being surrounded by this darkness that was going to kill me. The hauntings would continue even after I would leave for college. My parents would tell me that they would still hear sounds coming from the basement. Things eventually worked out that we ended up moving, and thankfully all of those things stayed behind. I have another personal ghost story that I thought I'd share with you. It's not terribly long, so I thought I'd throw it in here. One day I was driving home from high school. It was about 4:30 or 5, and I was coming home from practice. It was August, so it was still summertime, and the temperature was in the high 90s. As I was driving, I looked out my window to see a woman dressed in old colonial clothes. She was in all white. Keep in mind, I do come from an area where there are a lot of Civil War reenactments, so when I saw this, I initially wasn't afraid. When I passed her in my car, I looked in my rearview mirror to see her again, but she was gone. Like I said, it wasn't a terribly long story and not necessarily scary, just odd. When I was younger and still living in that haunted house, my family decided to take a trip down to Florida. This trip was part vacation, part business trip for my dad. My dad picked a hotel that was allegedly haunted. The hotel was old, but also quite nice. At night, my dad, myself, and brother would go out in the hotel and go ghost hunting. Obviously, we didn't really see anything, but we still had fun. On the last night there, we asked one of my dad's coworkers, who was also staying at that hotel, if he wanted to come ghost hunting with us. He declined, but little did he know, he would have an experience more terrifying than all of us. We had our ghost hunt and nothing happened. The next morning, we met up with my dad's coworker at breakfast. When we sat down for breakfast, he looked at us and said, "You guys aren't going to believe what happened to me last night." We listened with eager ears as he told us his story with what happened last night. After declining our ghost hunt, he went to bed quite early. However, in the middle of the night, he was awakened by something standing at the foot of his bed. He described it as a shadow figure. He called out to the figure, asking what he was doing, and the figure took off and ran. It didn't open any doors, but it was gone. It had vanished. He said when it was running off, the figure was silent, but he heard a weird sound. He got up and turned on the lights to examine the room. The figure was gone, and his door was still locked. As he was examining the room, he saw a weird object laying on the floor. The object turned out to be an old skeleton key, which he'd never seen before. He placed the key on his nightstand and went back to bed. He woke up the next morning thinking that whatever had happened the night before was simply just a dream, until he looked over at his nightstand. There sat the skeleton key. It's quite interesting to think that the person that didn't want to go ghost hunting turned out to find the most ghosts. out of all of us. This story comes from my dad. He travels for work quite a bit, so naturally, he has to stay in hotels. There was this one time he checked into a hotel, put all of his items down, and went out to dinner with his customers. When he came back to the hotel and tried to enter his room, he noticed that his room key wouldn't work. The door handle, instead of flashing green, flashed red. He double-checked and made sure that he was at the right room and tried again. He was definitely at the right room, so he swiped his key again, but still nothing. He eventually went down to the front counter to see if he could get a new key. They gave him a new one, so he went back and tried again. Still nothing. He went back down to the front counter and told them what had happened. Eventually, they had to call a maintenance guy to come down to help. When finally the maintenance guy arrived, he asked which room it was that needed help. My dad then told him, room 217. The maintenance guy looked in shock. "Oh, that room again," said the maintenance man. The maintenance man eventually told my dad what had happened in that room. About 3 weeks ago, there was a woman stabbed to death in that room. Her body was stuffed in a trunk at the foot of the bed. The maintenance man probably shouldn't have shared this info. They tried to get the door handle to work, and eventually they just had to pry it open. They also noticed that the deadlock on the door was bolted closed from the inside. Once inside, my dad saw that his items were thrown about. His suitcase sat empty on top of the trunk at the foot of the bed. His clothes were thrown about the room. I remember that he told me, out of curiosity, he decided to open the trunk to see what was inside. The carpet on the bottom of the trunk had been removed, and the wood on the bottom of the trunk was stained red. He asked right then and there for another room. This story comes from a Reddit user, SpiritBug165. My first sighting of this being was when I was a little girl staying at my grandmother's house. I would sleep in the living room that was constructed by my late father, and I am about 5 years old. I felt very safe, or I should have. I kind of already been prepped by overhearing stories of how my grandmother had experienced some incidents in the nights that couldn't be explained, like sleep paralysis, weird ongoings, etc. I didn't care to understand them fully. I just thought I'd never have to deal with that because I believed that my late father was always protecting me. Each night I woke up at the exact same time. The same cartoon shows playing on the TV every night is what tipped me off as a kid. Not knowing why I was awake, just knowing that I would get to watch crude cartoons that were usually meant for older kids. I would end up looking forward to waking up the first couple of times it would happen. But then, it became different soon. Once I woke up because I heard a woman's voice. Then I felt someone sit down next to me another night. Once I remember plainly that I woke up and I wasn't able to move my body. Not because of sleep paralysis, but because I felt something behind me. I felt that if I stayed still, it would think that I was still asleep and it would go away. This particular incident happened often enough, usually once a night after I would wake up at the usual 3 a.m. time. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I doubled down on my belief that I had my father to protect me. I remember seeing it out of the corner of my eye, the entire room being covered with big windows and large houseplants. It became very easy to play off that I had an overactive imagination. I would still wake up at 3 a.m. I still sense a female presence actually waking me up, and I still, every night, could sense a tall, dark, broad-shouldered shadow at the corner of the room. It was as if I could feel him beckoning me to turn my head just enough to see it completely. It wasn't a matter of being fast enough either. If you were brave and turned your head quickly, you'd see misshapen shadows of large houseplants and shadows darker than dark. You just couldn't trust what your eyes would see in the shadows when you're a child, and I understood that. But what I couldn't explain is how I already knew what he looked like. How tall he was, so I had no need to try and catch it with my eyes. But I did become brave. Eventually, after being up at 3 a.m. every night, I would get so used to daring myself to look into the shadows. Each night I knew if I was brave enough to walk towards these shadows, I'd be able to make it to the kitchen and get into my grandfather's secret candy stash. For that to happen, I had to face my fears and walk towards the shadows, and through a dark corridor that connected the room I was in with the rest of the house. It was probably the scariest part, seeing the enormous dark man out of my mind's eye, sometimes out of the corner of my eye. You could just feel him there, his shoulders easily a meter and his height at least 10 feet. The shadow was male, and he was darker than black. He had a managing atmosphere, and sometimes I felt like I was imagining it talking to me, telling me things that weren't normal. I questioned my childish imagination and went over and over before I finally told my mom, and even then, it's hard to tell anyone something so crazy and expect them to believe you fully without thinking it's just your imagination. It's a child, what can you expect kind of deal. Years later, my cousin, who was 5 years younger than me, and maybe 11 at the time, starts sleeping in the same living room where I'd slept as a child, and sees this figure. Long since I'd given up on actually telling anyone what I believed this thing looked like, or the story behind my firm belief the house was occupied by something. My cousin woke up my uncle screaming. She was normally a very smart and quiet kid. Everything she did had a purpose, and to this day, it rings true to her personality. But that night, my uncle couldn't get into the room fast enough, and before he could even get out of bed, she was in his room, unable to give him any explanation. After she calmed down, she said there was a man, a tall, dark man who had come through the French doors that are in front of the sleeping couch. She said that she couldn't move, and all she could do was watch him move closer, and then eventually stood and watched her, never moving. She said the only reason she made it out is because she willed herself to run out of the room like I did when I was a child. She saw it, full on saw this thing, and it had trapped her. Almost as if it had learned from its encounter with me as a child and wanted to be seen because I acknowledged it and refused to look at it. My cousin was absolutely blindsided by this event and would never come back to sleep in that room, ever again. Since then, it's felt like it was just a bad dream. Everyone pretty much knows the house is old and active, and everyone has some experience of some kind. Everyone literally chooses to ignore it all and chalk it up to being an old house with quirks. Being woken up in the middle of the night is definitely my uncle's chief complaint. He says sometimes it's a woman's voice saying his name, and he gets touched at least once a week. My mother now has to stay in his room because it's a small house. His room is located in a hall with a bathroom connected and across from the kitchen. It's well lit usually and not at all creepy. But just the other night my mother was going to the bathroom, and what she saw stopped her dead in her path as she drew in a gasp. It was a shadow man, tall at the ceiling with broad shoulders, standing next to the microwave in a very well lit kitchen. And I mean well lit, as in the lights are on, and there is a darker than black shadow, bigger than any human, standing in practically the middle of the room, and the light does not pass through it. She immediately went into the bathroom and tried to make sense out of what she saw. It was exactly what I had imagined in my mind's eye as a child. Large, broad, big and tall, dark, and had so much disdain and anger within. I sense it doesn't like women at all. While I was in high school, I had a really awesome job working security at a cemetery that was just a couple of miles away from my house. It literally was the graveyard shift, but I didn't mind it. For one, I never saw anyone out there, and two, I was allowed to stay in my truck and listen to the radio all night. This was awesome, mainly because I didn't believe in ghosts, and also I got paid hourly just to listen to the radio. My enthusiasm for my job slowly dissipated as a couple of events that I can't explain occurred, slowly turning me into a believer. The first thing that happened that I thought was really strange was the odd mist that would only come in during the nighttime. This made shining my flashlight around the dark cemetery all that more difficult. I wrote off the mist as just being the cold weather during the night, a rather simple explanation. There were parts of the graveyard that I would avoid at night, Not because I was afraid or anything, but mainly because my radio didn't get that great of reception. I would always get a blend of these two stations around this one tombstone, which I always thought was weird. It was the only part in the graveyard that it would do it. On the tombstone, the death date was June 6th, 2006. 666. I'm not superstitious, but I always thought that was weird. The next thing that I noticed that I thought was odd were the lights. When I say lights, I'm not referring to the lampposts. I'm referring to actual lights that floated and hovered around the cemetery. At first, I thought they were lightning bugs, but those typically give off a greenish-yellow glow for a few seconds. These lights that I would sometimes see were white. They did move slowly and didn't last for very long. I wrote this off as a mixture between the mist that hovered in the graveyard and the passing cars that would sometimes pass throughout the night. These lights didn't scare me, they just made me uneasy. It was as if the spirits of the graveyard were reminding me that I wasn't alone. The things that did scare me were the shadow people. I remember seeing my first shadow person. I thought someone had broken into the graveyard. At this point in my security career, I didn't believe in the paranormal. Because of that, the only rational explanation that I could come up with was that someone had broken in and that I needed to find them. I left my truck and chased after them. I obviously ended up empty-handed, as well as a good distance away from my truck than I originally wanted to be. On my walk back from my frivolous pursuit, I thought I heard whispering all around me. Normally, I would write this off as the wind in the trees, but I heard actual words, as well as my name, my full name. This obviously bothered me, and I spent the rest of the evening inside my truck. There was another time I was doing a patrol inside my truck while I was listening to the radio. I was disoriented with all the mist, and I hadn't realized I was near the 666 tombstone, and my radio went on the fritz. Instead of just merging two radio stations, I heard something very deep and growling coming from my radio. It told me the exact day I would die in a very demonic voice. This event wasn't nearly as scary, but a part of me is quite curious as to see if this would be correct. Granted, this experience was probably someone just fooling around on the radio late at night, but you better believe me when I tell you I have that exact date written down. The best ghost story I think I've ever heard was that of my best friend's aunt. The way that my best friend put it was that she was always interesting. She was a hippie and did drugs, but she always somehow had money. Like most people with money, they tend to collect things. My best friend's Aunt Margaret's case was that she collected porcelain dolls. Anyways, here's the story. In the mid-80s, Aunt Margaret was in her mid-20s. Like I said earlier, she did a lot of drugs, so I don't know how much of this is true. She was at a local flea market, going from booth to booth examining the different products that they were selling, when her eye caught a particular booth. The booth wasn't much different than the others. However, the woman sitting behind the booth was covered in jewelry. But that's not what caught her eye. Sitting next to the woman in jewelry was a large porcelain doll. The woman and the doll seemed to be having a conversation, obviously the doll not responding, but the woman responding for her in a little girl's voice. The aunt, not being freaked out, approached the booth. She couldn't help notice the fine details that were on the doll. The doll was rather immaculate, and unlike any doll she'd ever seen. She simply had to have it for her collection, and asked the woman how much for the doll. The woman paused, and after a few seconds of silence, she finally shook her head, saying, "I can't sell this to you. However, I can give it to you, as long as you promise to talk to it every day." Seeing this as a great opportunity to acquire a nice doll for her collection, the aunt agreed. She took the doll home and, as promised, talked to the doll every day. Obviously, the doll would never respond, move, or even give off a bad vibe. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, around this time, the aunt was accidentally struck by a mail truck and had to be hospitalized for 2 days. This is where things took a turn for the worst. Upon arriving home, the aunt noticed that the home had a weird vibe to it. Instead of having a hip and chill vibe that the house normally had, the house was much more eerie, as if there was something there that shouldn't be. The dolls in the collection that normally sat on the shelf were on the floor, all except for the one doll. Her dogs and cats would seemingly avoid the doll at all costs. During the night, she swore that she heard someone talking in the other room. After investigating with her loaded pistol, she found that no one was there. She started to suspect that this paranormal activity was centered around this doll. To test her theory, she decided to lock that doll up in the attic. All throughout the night, she was able to hear what sounded like stomping with heavy boots coming from the attic. Rather than thinking of the doll, she actually thought that there was an intruder in her attic. After calling the police and having them investigate the attic, they found nothing. With everything that had happened and the circumstances surrounding how she acquired the doll, she finally decided to place the doll in an old trunk and to donate it to a thrift store. This would be the last time she'd see the doll, as well as the last time any activity would go on in the house. To this day, my best friend's aunt still collects dolls, despite everything that had happened. We ask her every now and then if she regrets getting rid of the doll or pawning it off onto someone else. She only responds with, "It's no longer my problem." I used to be a paranormal junkie back in my college days, and even after I graduated. I was a part of a group that would meet twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, to plan and investigate haunted locations throughout the United States. Our group was surprisingly big for my town, and even though it wasn't a college-funded organization, we were allowed to use some of the buildings on campus to host our meetings. Most of the people in our group were older and didn't even attend the university, but we would always get new members every week or so to come with us on investigations. Most of our investigations were eerie, but if you are a non-believer, then it could get boring really quick. During my time with the group, we had to get permission from the place's owner to host our investigations there, which made things difficult considering most places didn't have an active owner, at least places worth investigating. There was one place 2 towns over we tried to get permission from, but the owners of the facility always declined our offer to investigate due to the buildings being unsafe for people to be inside. Unsafe in terms of structural integrity rather than paranormal danger. The place in question was an old hotel back in the early 1900s that had seen an unusual amount of deaths on the property. It was rumored that the hotel had to shut down due to the high levels of paranormal activity, and even to this day, passerbys would report sounds and sightings from the street alone. If people were reporting activity from the streets, then you know that this place must have been a gold mine. The group was very strict with its permission policy. We were not allowed to investigate, or we could face a lifetime ban if we were caught. This caused many people to follow the rules. However, there were some diehard believers like me that were dying to investigate the haunted hotel. I was able to gather together some friends and rogue members of the group to go and investigate this hotel late one night. This turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life. We met up together at the local Burger King and had dinner as a group and got ourselves mentally prepared for one of the best investigations yet. We were excited, yet also nervous due to us actually breaking the law by trespassing. Little did we know that we were nervous about the wrong thing. We drive over to the next town to where the haunted hotel is, and all of us are quiet in anticipation. Normally we are talking about what type of activity we'll most likely see or sharing personal ghost stories, but not on this ride. I think that most of us were getting in our own heads with the rumors of the high levels of activity, but we were also worried about being caught by the police. We finally arrived to the location. The building itself doesn't necessarily stand out, but you could tell that it's seen better days. We park our car down the street and hike up to the hotel. We walk around the hotel for about 5 minutes looking for an entrance, and we finally find one. However, it was less than ideal. Most of the doors and windows were boarded up with these thick, heavy boards. However, there was a board on the basement window that you could partially remove if you pulled on it. We were able to get all of our members inside the basement, even though we had to squeeze through. Once all of us were inside, we were able to begin our investigation. Right away, we felt uneasy. Thankfully, we had our equipment with us, as well as our flashlights. We were able to shine around the basement to see that the basement was mainly empty. Before we started investigating, we wanted to find the stairs that led up to the hotel. We considered that that would be the best place to find paranormal activity to document. After a 15-minute search, we were able to discover that the stairs were behind a closed door. While we were looking for the stairs in the basement, I felt a presence down there with us. Quick backstory about me. While growing up, I was able to see spirits as a child, but not very clearly, just more like their energy. For some reason in this basement, I was detecting very dark energy I've never came across before, or since. Rather than wanting to investigate, I just wanted to leave the basement as soon as I could. I didn't share this information with my group members, which I now consider a mistake. Looking back, we should have just left, right then and there. As soon as we found the stairs, we left the basement. Most of the group seemed relieved, although not by much. The hotel was rather empty and dark. For some reason, our flashlights didn't really seem to penetrate the darkness like they used to. The darkness seemed extra thick, almost as if it was a fog. We debated on separating into groups to investigate the hotel. We ultimately decided to stay together, which would probably be one of the only decisions I don't regret doing that night. While we investigated as a group, I saw one of the group members starting to light candles and placing them in a circle. She then pulled a board out of her bag. I immediately knew what she was doing. She was setting up a Ouija board. I'd only ever used a Ouija board once before, and that was at a party. Granted, I was pretty drunk and no one took it seriously. However, I was always kind of afraid of them. Being able to see energy is one thing, but it's another to set up a line of communication to who knows where. The person finished lighting candles in a circle, and we all sat down. Everyone put their equipment down and sat around the board. The person that brought the board began asking questions while all of us were touching the planchette. The girl that brought the board, her name's Megan, started to ask, "Is there anyone here with us?" At first, the planchette didn't move, but it slowly made its way over to the yes on the board. At this time, I felt a weird static in the room. The hairs on the back of my neck started to stand. Megan then asked, "Are you a boy or girl?" The planchette, rather somewhat quickly, spelled out girl. "How old are you?" Megan asked. The planchette moved to the number 7. Right after we got that answer, we heard a loud creak coming from the wooden floorboards behind us, as if someone walked behind us. We stopped playing, just for a moment, and shined a flashlight behind us. There was no one there. We then turned off the flashlight and hesitantly went back to the game. We then asked the female spirit, "What's your name?" The planchette spelled Mary. We then asked Mary how many spirits lived in this hotel. We didn't get a number, but it spelled out many. Before we could ask another question, the planchette moved to goodbye. One of the group members blurted out, "Wait, Mary, we're not done yet. Don't leave." The planchette remained motionless. Another group member then asked the board, "Is there anyone else here that wants to talk to us?" The planchette moved to yes. I then got that feeling again, that feeling of dark energy. The room got cold, and I felt the tingling on my neck intensify. We asked, "Are you a boy or girl?" The board spelled out, "Neither." As a group, we were kind of confused. Someone else then asked, "Well, how old are you?" The candle seemed to dim as it spelled out, "Never born." It started to dawn on me that whatever we were speaking to, whatever that I was feeling, was not human. I immediately wanted to stop playing, but the group insisted. They were curious as to whatever it was we were talking to. I nervously looked around the room as they continued playing. I was able to see something tall and dark standing in the corner. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The next few moments I don't really recall. I just remember a rush of energy and my sight going black. The next thing I realize, I'm being held down by my group. Some of the members are crying while others are yelling at me to snap out of it. I don't know what's happening and I start to freak out. Seeing that I'm back to normal, my group lets go of me and I stand up. Instead of trying to figure out what just happened, my group then ushers me into the basement, telling me that it's time for us to leave. In the rush of everything, I accidentally leave all of my equipment behind, and we make our way into the basement. While searching for the board that we entered from, we hear loud stomping coming from above us. We finally found the board that we entered and start making our way out. While we're leaving, I can hear loud whispers coming from behind us. I'm covered in tears and sweat and I don't know what's going on. I feel extremely fatigued, as if I just ran a marathon. But somehow the adrenaline in my system kept me from passing out. We finally all make it out of the basement and we run to the car that's parked down the street. We get in the car and we start driving home, most of us crying and in tears, while the rest are breathing heavy. While on the car ride home, I'm able to figure out what had happened when I blacked out. Apparently, during our session, when I blacked out, I stood up and started shaking, as if I was a newborn baby that had no idea how to walk. After a few seconds of struggling to walk, I finally stand upright. The group is able to see that my eyes are completely white. They then told me that I tried to attack a group member with my fingernails. It took 3 of the group members to hold me down, and that's when I came to. The whole ordeal couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but it was obviously enough to traumatize the group. That night was my last investigation. The group that met on campus caught wind of what had happened and kicked me out of the group. I obviously had no desire to go back anyways. However, it has crossed my mind once or twice to go back to the hotel to recover my old equipment, but deep down I know that that would be a terrible idea. One afternoon while my dad was at work, I was in my bedroom playing with Matchbox cars and other toys while my mom was in the kitchen, getting lunch ready for us. According to her, she heard me talking. This in itself wasn't out of the ordinary, as I usually would make sounds and create stories with whatever toys I was playing with. I had an incredible imagination back then, and still do thankfully. However, this particular occasion was different. She heard me carrying on one side of what sounded to her like a full conversation. As moms often do, she walked down the hall to the doorway of my bedroom and asked me who I was talking to. While I was sitting on the floor of my room, I told her very nonchalantly that I was just talking to the lady at the end of my bed. She played it cool and didn't show any sort of fear or apprehension about what I said, but later told me that since she was home alone with 2 small children at the time, that she was a bit freaked out. She asked the normal questions about this lady. Was she young or old? Was she nice or scary? Etc. And I, without slipping a beat, told her that she was nice and she was an older lady, apparently, who was simply inquiring about my toys and what I was doing. I didn't seem scared and acted as though it was no big deal. I will say that around this time, I did have an imaginary friend who I called Harry. But let me be clear that this was not Harry, and I never had more than one imaginary friend, that I can assure you. She and I have discussed this event only a couple of times in the years since, and I never gave it much more than a second thought. That is until my grandma, my mom's mom, somehow managed to bring up a similar but separate event later on. She would come and visit from Pennsylvania for months at a time, mainly to help with my mom, while my sister was at home while everyone else was at work. My grandma was a very serious, no-nonsense, but funny and gregarious old Polish woman. She wouldn't take any gruff, but was extremely loving and dotted us kids. When we picked her up from the train station one time, I was in junior high. We somehow got on the subject of ghosts and supernatural occurrences, when she said something to the effect of, "Then there was that time when I asked you who you were talking to in your room, and you said that you were just talking to the lady at the end of your bed." She had about the same reaction as my mom, according to her, and left it at that. If those two conferred about it together, I never heard of it, or at least until that day in the car with my grandmother. But apparently they did compare notes when my grandmother mentioned the occurrence to my mom. That day in the car though, I got chills. I had only ever heard this story from my mother, and for all I know before that, it just had been a dream or an occurrence that I'd managed to forget the bulk of. But the more I thought about it, the more I remember that particular time, that room, and having the benefit of photographic memory, I could almost see this lady in my mind's eye. She's older, silver hair, and had a gentle demeanor overall. That's about as far as my memory of her goes. I have never forgotten this story. As some of you may know, England is very rich with history, a very bloody history, that is. Needless to say, England is not a stranger to ghost stories. Having grown up here, I have a couple, but for the sake of time, I'll only share one. This one took place when I was a teenager, working in the city. I won't tell you the name of my city, but after hearing the description, you could probably guess it. I was working as a barista in a not-so-busy part of town. This was both good and bad for me. Good because I'm pretty lazy and didn't want to work, but bad because it was bad for business and my tips. The location, however, was quite unique. Our building sat on top of a World War II bunker for civilians when they were being air raided by the Germans. Our basement had a tunneling system that connected all the businesses underneath. As cool as this sounds, it's actually kinda creepy. We didn't keep that much inventory in our basement. In fact, all that was down there was a fuse box and maybe a couple of boxes. However, if and when the fuse would blow, one of us would have to go down into the basement. What makes this so creepy is that the tunnels are pretty dark and allegedly haunted. Luckily for me, the first 2 years I worked there, I was not allowed to go into the basement. This is because only managers in our store were allowed to. However, once I got promoted to manager, everything changed. The first 6 months of being manager were great. I enjoyed the extra pay and did not have to go down to the basement for anything. However, everything changed when we got a new set of coffee makers. If we had more than 3 coffee makers going on at the same time, it would blow a fuse and turn off all of our power. This would then require me to go into the basement and find the fuse box and flip the fuse. Like I said earlier, the basement was an old war tunnel and connected to other businesses on our street. This was kinda cool that we all shared this basement tunnel together, but also kind of spooky. Whenever I'd go into the basement for any reason, I would always get this weird feeling in the back of my neck. It was kind of like static electricity, right before you're about to touch something metallic, like this buildup of energy. Anyways, back to my story. It was a dark afternoon. Well, I should say darker, considering England's pretty overcast for most of the year. It was our second week with the coffee makers. The fuse would blow about every other day, and we hadn't yet realized why it was doing that. I went down into the basement. The basement was eerily dark. The only source of light I had was a tiny flashlight that I had on my keychain. Needless to say, I was pretty spooked going down into the basement. Like I said, the basement was the tunnel that connected all the businesses above, so once I made it to the bottom of the stairs, I began my walk down the tunnel. The LED flashlight on my keychain that my mother gave to me for Christmas was proving quite useful, and yet I was not able to see that far down into the tunnel. As I was walking to the fuse box, that feeling of static electricity came to the back of my neck. For some reason, this would always heighten my senses, as if I was trying to look or to hear for something that was with me in the tunnel.
I reached the fuse box and I opened it. There was a special sequence I had to do to get the fuses to work again, and I was trying to remember. While I was doing that, I could have sworn I heard someone walking down the tunnel. This was a good ways away, and it sounded like someone was slowly walking towards me, as if they didn't want to be heard. This made me nervous, and I tried my best to get the fuses working again. The sound of someone walking got louder and louder, as if whoever was down here with me was getting pretty close. I checked once or twice with my flashlight, but I never saw anyone down there. Granted, my flashlight only probably had about 20 feet of visibility. That's not very far. I then began to hear what sounded like someone whispering. Right when the whispering was getting louder, I was able to fix the fuse box and turn the breakers back on. The lights in the tunnel lit up and I was able to see I was in the tunnel alone. I quickly made my way up the stairs and into the cafe. After an hour or two of replaying the moments in my mind, I then began to realize that the tunnel was pretty old and carried sound very well. The walking sound that I heard that sounded like it was in the tunnel was probably from above. Same thing for the whispering. 3 days later, the same thing happened. The fuse went out and I had to go back into the basement. Except this time, I came prepared and brought a real flashlight instead of the dinky one on my keychain. I slowly crept into the basement, remembering the events only days earlier. I shined my flashlight all the way down into the tunnel and I could barely make out the other end. I was clearly alone in the tunnel, but it was always good just to make sure. As I began walking over to the fuse box, that same feeling on my neck began, except this time it was accompanied by this strong feeling of evil. I could tell whatever it was wanted to hurt me. I quickly jogged over to the fuse box. By this time, I was practically a pro, and it did not take me much time to get the lights back on. Instead of hearing sounds in the tunnel, I instead saw something. At the end of the tunnel looked like what appeared to be a man. It was at a distance at which you almost had to squint your eyes. This tunnel was accessible to the other businesses that were above it, so the idea that someone else was down there wasn't completely foreign. However, it was kinda creepy that he was down there in the dark. Being slightly creeped out, I gave a slight wave to ease my nerves. The man at the other end didn't wave. He just stood there. I quickly ran up the stairs and back into the cafe. I have since quit the cafe, and I sometimes think back about my experiences down in those tunnels. I often wonder what was down there with me in the darkness.